Now it's time to begin our session. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alessandra Nilo. I'm Executive Director of GESTOS, an NGO based in Brazil. I'm also a co-facilitator of the 2003 working group for civil society in Brazil that is leading the process for monitoring the implementation of the SDGs in our countries. But I'm here in my condition as operative partner for the Women's Major representing Latin America and the Caribbean. So this is an event carefully prepared by the Women's Major Group, co-sponsored by all these organizations that you can see here on the screen. The idea is really to discuss what is the kind of partnership that we need to achieve the SDGs, to achieve the climate and Paris targets, to achieve the agreement of Addis Ababa. At some point after the COVID-19 and during the COVID-19 pandemic, we start hearing again about, for instance, the importance of the public sector on health. It was a moment that gave us some kind of hope. Perhaps some governments are beginning again to think about the importance of the public systems to support areas such as health, education, social assistance, etc., etc. But when the process advanced, and we are here now almost 3 years after the pandemic crisis, we don't see that happening. And that's why we felt that it is so important to have this conversation today. So we'd like to do that, also considering, of course, this triple crisis that we are facing, but at the same time, trying to put some gender lens on this conversation. And we see, as you saw the agenda for this high-level political forum, we can see that it's not only us that are concerned about the type of public partnerships that are in place. And particularly because most of these partnerships are not really including civil society organizations, and much less, they are not including feminist perspectives, women's perspectives. So we are in many ways left behind in terms of partnerships, including if you take a look on the SDGs, the only targets that refer to civil society specifically is the 17.17, and it's about public PPPs, but we have at this moment no capacity to inform what are the numbers of these partnerships with civil society, what is the quality of these partnerships with society, what is the impact of these partnerships with civil society. So I'm very, very happy. I will ask Maitre to put the next slide. And the next slide, please. So I'm really happy to be here today with our panelists and our discussants that I will introduce to you properly to address these particular issues. So I'd like to talk about effective and inclusive, diverse, and gender transformative public partnerships to overcome austerity policies that have led to the privatization of public services and their effects on grassroots communities. We know that that the economic and commercial determinants at this point are really undermining the human rights of many communities, and particularly our rights as women. We also like to hear about leveraging public finance to support the accountable and transparent governance of public services that are required for the enjoyment of human rights and the environmental integrity. Something also about the public development banks, which is a conversation very updated at this moment, very hot topic for all of us at this moment. because of course, we don't see any possibility of having these public investments being again and again and again, use it to support projects and sectors not aligned with the SDGs and Paris climate agreements. We also would like to have some kind of conversations around what is the cohesion within member states and UN. We have also seen a lot of conversations during this high-level political forum, particularly around, for instance, the next summit of the future, conversations about where will be the best institution to coordinate the new financial architecture. We think that it should be under the UN mandate, but it's not what seems that is going to happen. What is the gender perspective in these public investments and in these partnerships? And particularly, what do we need to do to push forward with the idea that women should be considered the leaders in terms of sustainable development? We need to push forward for language recognizing women as leaders in this process of sustainable development. So in general, this conversation is about economic democracy. And it's about our participation. This is about how can we ensure we will have our public resources, use it according to our needs as, people that this government should be serving. The next one, please. So here you have a beautiful photo from us, from me, that I introduced myself, and I have the honor to have Barbara Adams with us today. Barbara is chair of the board of the Global Policy Forum and served as a senior policy advisor on independent policy watchdog that monitors the work of United Nations, and she follow-ups everything related to global policy making. And Barbara will help in this conversation, so she will be our discussant, and then the idea is that we will hear our panelists, and then we will return to Barbara to make her incredible and very right to the target comments. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Bonnie Berry from Save the Children. Bonnie has a demonstrated history working with government and non-governmental organizations in the field of human rights and international policy. And she has an extensive work on grants management, intergovernmental negotiations, communication, and research. So Bonnie, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and thank you to the Women's Major Group for inviting me to speak amongst such distinguished other panelists and moderators. And thank you, colleagues, for attending this evening's event. So I'm a senior advocacy advisor at Save the Children International, based here in New York. And also a member of the Civil Society Financing for Development Mechanism, which includes the Women's Working Group on FMD. I wanted to start before I jump into the question around reforming taxation to address the question that I get often asked about Save the Children and why it engages in financing for development discussions. And I mean, to me, it's obvious, but I think it often isn't. But when you think about it, a child-focused agency, it makes absolute sense that we would be engaging in these issues, because public investment in children is the foundation for strong and resilient families, communities, and society. So Save the Children, we engage in advocacy to both increase the amount of resources that countries have to invest in development, but also to ensure that it is allocated in a way that benefits and does not harm children. So now to the question. Well, a little bit of background on gender and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. We all know that governments invest in gender equality, or that when governments invest in gender equality and women's empowerment, there's not only women and girls that benefit, but all of us, and especially children. Conversely, we all know that when governments underinvest in gender equality, it's children that suffer greatly. And member states recognize this through the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which integrated gender considerations across each one of its chapters, emphasizing not just women's and girls' human rights, but also the contribution of gender equality, women's empowerment, and their full and equal participation and leadership in the economy to sustainable development for all. And in the first paragraph, countries committed to ensuring gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment and committed themselves to transformative actions and enforceable legislation to ensure equal rights for women while promoting gender responsive budgeting and tracking. And to comprehensively achieve women and girls' empowerment and the full achievement of their rights, governments absolutely need to have the fiscal space to invest in them. Domestic resource mobilization, or taxation, is essential to generating public finance to meet the budgetary needs to invest in women's health, including in sexual and reproductive health and rights, their education and skills development, social protection, childcare services and child protection, as well as other public services that are essential for all of our welfare, like safe water, hygiene, and building resiliency against climate change and protecting the environment. Investment in these public services not only benefits women and their families that women care for, including children, but also elderly and other family members that cannot work or support the family. And it also strengthens the state's role in the delivery of public services that can help relieve the burden of care work that so frequently falls on women and girls. However, the way that tax systems are designed, they're largely biased against women, particularly those that are the poorest and facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. This bias impacts families and children and exacerbates inequality and perpetuates the intergenerational cycle of poverty. For instance, in low-income countries, much of the tax revenue is generated through indirect taxes like value-added tax, which taxes consumption of basic commodities that families rely on and are often procured by women. Meanwhile, wealthy individuals and corporations currently pay less tax than poor people around the world. And this is enabled by low personal income and corporate tax rates, as well as exemptions, like exemptions on inheritance and capital gains. And it is also enabled through loopholes and financial structures and systems that systematically disadvantage lower income countries by enabling widespread tax avoidance and evasion, primarily by multinational corporations that through profit shifting and practices to avoid paying taxes in jurisdictions where they have operations and where profits are made. This situation has hampered the ability of all countries to invest in sustainable development, women's and girls' empowerment, gender equality, and child rights, and to achieve the 2030 pledge to leave no one behind and to reach those furthest behind first. And it has particularly harmed lower income countries who are already furthest behind and contributed to further widespread inequality and inequity between countries and within. So what do we need? At the domestic level, we need progressive taxation systems that will address inequalities faced by women and children, and to address the large unpaid care work burden of women outside the formal labor market. We also need the removal of unhelpful tax exemptions, strengthen capacity and effective tax administration, and importantly, greater tax transparency and citizen participation. At the global level, we need greater tax cooperation and transparency to address those loopholes and structures that facilitate the illicit financial flows and direct resources away from developing countries to unaccountable tax havens. And we need the forthcoming UN international tax cooperation discussions to deliver a UN tax convention negotiated through inclusive and intergovernmental negotiations. A global tax convention would help deliver the coherence and fairness that we just so desperately need in the international taxation system, and thereby enable countries to advance gender responsive tax rules to provide a stronger foundation for investing in women and children, address inequalities, and increase financing available to address the climate and environmental crisis, and to prepare and respond to future crises. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you for setting the scene and also to remind us that we don't lack solutions. We know what we need, right? So with that, I'd like to give the floor to Jemimah. Jemimah, it's correct. Jemimah, sorry. Jemimah Njuki. She is the Chief of Economic Empowerment Section at the UNWOMEN. She is a recognized leader of gender equality and women's empowerment, having directed global initiatives promoting women's economic empowerment. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and warm thanks to the Women's Major Group for the invitation to come to this really critical and timely conversation. I'll just start by saying, I think some things that we all know, but it's always good to remind ourselves that no crisis is gender neutral. We are facing multiple crises, and those crises are not gender neutral. We are seeing impacts on women. We are seeing impacts on girls. The climate crisis especially is threatening women's rights and livelihoods and intensifying the disproportionate share of unpaid work and domestic work that women do. In turn, this is constraining women's and girls' ability to participate meaningfully in a lot of areas, including economic participation. At UNWOMEN, we have been working on public financing and working with multiple partners, including member states, including governments, other UN agencies, to really spotlight the impact of this crisis on women and girls. At the onset of the war in Ukraine, we got together and looked at what the impacts of that crisis were on women and girls. There was a food crisis response group that was looking at the impact on food, on financing, on climate, on energy, on oil prices, without looking at what the disproportionate impact on women and girls from those issues were. And so it's been very important that we are putting a spotlight on this. We highlighted the global gender impacts of that crisis on energy access, on food security, and on nutrition, together with the UN Global Crisis Response Group. We know that financing going to women is an issue of social justice. Financing going to manage these multiple crises is an issue of social justice. So we know the demand for action is loud and clear. The science is clear. The gender impacts are clear. And yet still global action and the public investments are lacking. We know women are leading change in many ways. Feminist organizations, women's rights organizations, women-led organizations in their full diversity are taking actions on the ground. And despite this recognition, very little funding globally is directed to gender responsive action, whether it's climate mitigation, whether it's climate adaptation. And we know without a gender lens, climate policy and funding frameworks can perpetuate embedded inequalities and discrimination, and thereby reduce effectiveness of anything that we plan to do. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the things we are doing at UNWOMEN and how we are partnering with different groups to do this. We are advancing advancing a feminist climate action and gender responsive just transitions with multiple stakeholders around the globe, including member states, the UN system, civil society, and the private sector, where appropriate, and building on our triple mandate to both to look at the normative framework, coordinating the UN system to respond appropriately, but also operational work with our country offices around the world. So a couple of things. We are part of something called the Finance in Common. And the Finance in Common is a group of over 500 public development banks that have come together as a coalition. And within that coalition, there is a group of those banks that are committed to gender equality, and we are working with them. We co-chair that gender equality coalition of these public development banks. Every year we co-chair it, UNWOMEN and one of the public development banks. Last year we co-chaired it with the African Development Bank. This year we are co-chairing it with the Inter-American Development Bank. And the idea is that we can work with these banks so that they are developing innovative instruments to provide funding to women led initiatives, but also to issues that are important to women, whether these are on climate action, whether these are on funding, care infrastructure, or different elements. And we publish a report every year to actually show what are some of the investments that the banks have actually made to these issues. The second area of work I'll talk about is we are working with governments on investments to the care economy. Now, for a long time, governments have looked at investments in the care economy as a cost to them. And this has really constrained the expansion of care services, publicly funded care services. And so what we are doing together with ILO, and what we've done is develop tools, policy tools that allow them to cost the care, but also that allow them to see what impacts will these investments have. And these impacts span a whole range of impacts, including how many jobs are going to be created from these investments. What kind of revenue streams do governments get? What impact does this have on gender equality? What does it have on governments reducing their labor force participation? Because we know a lot of those care jobs will go to women. So we've actually shown, for example, that investing in care creates 40 to 60% more jobs than investing in the construction sector. And these are important evidence basis for governments to actually make those decisions. The third thing I want to talk about is on gender responsive budgeting. We are working with over 63 countries on gender responsive budgeting, making sure that public finances, the way public finances are being allocated is actually going to gender equality outcomes. This is important because if the money, and we work a lot with ministries of finance, ministries of planning, because in many cases they're making decisions about allocations to different ministries, allocations to different activities. And by supporting them with those tools that allow them to do gender responsive budgeting, then we see resources actually, public funding resources actually going to these issues. We are contributing to building the evidence base. We have a global program called Women Count, where we are supporting national statistical offices to also collect gender statistics and sex disaggregated data to actually show what is really happening to women, whether it's on unpaid care, whether it's on the gender climate nexus, to make sure that this evidence is actually being collected at a global level. We are also working with other UN agencies to really surface some of the issues around gender equality. Very recently, we worked with UNIDO to publish a guide on gender equality in the sustainable energy transition. Because if gender issues do not get integrated as we figure out what a just transition means, we will come again as often after the fact to then say, oh, where is the gender? How do we get it in here? What does it mean? So really making sure that those conversations as they advance, that gender is an important component of this. We know we need flexible funding, mechanisms that support women, civil society, grassroots, and feminist organizations. The global financial architecture is not really structured to support local organizations that are driving action on the ground. So there's a whole reform of that global system that needs to happen. But we also need in countries gender equality mechanisms, the ministries of gender, those machineries, to actually have the capacity to effectively influence other parts of government, whether it's ministries of environment in terms of how they develop their national adaptation plans, whether it's ministries of infrastructure in terms of making decisions about what kinds of infrastructure to prioritize. But that requires that we actually work very, very closely with those ministries of gender and gender machineries as UNWOMEN to see how they can be strengthened enough to actually influence what's happening around the public funding and public management systems. I will stop there.
Thank you, Jemimah. I think it's so important at this point to remind us that we don't lack evidence, right? And it's important also to build these papers and rationale to show what happens when we don't invest in women, and that these public crises that we are facing are effectively a result of not investing in women. I was very interested also in this financing common that you mentioned, because I learned today that out from 186 central banks that exist in the world, only 22 are led by women. And this also brings to us the question of women's participation in the decision-making process. And we have a colleague that used to say that when you are not participating in the table to make decisions, probably you are in the menu, right? To serve and to be eaten by your colleagues. So thank you very much for reminding us all of that and for this work. And with that, I'd like to give the floor to Mabel Bianco. I don't know if I need to introduce Mabel Bianco. But even though I will introduce Mabel Bianco. Mabel Bianco is one of the fierce feminists that we know. She was in the beginning of the creation of the Women's Major Group, probably also responsible for the creation of the Women's Major Group. She's leading the feminist agenda in Latin America and the Caribbean and globally. And she's president of FEIM, the Foundation for Research on Women's Issues in Argentina. And it's a very, very big pleasure to have you here with us, Mabel. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. I need to say that to speak about the impact and how we move away from the impacts is something that we are trying to do, and we couldn't. And one of the problems is because nothing changed after the pandemic. We want to change the model. We want to change how we manage, but we couldn't. We have this, I have there, we were telling about the issue, feminist bond system change, nothing changed, everything is the same. So this is something that we need to recognize, that we couldn't promote the change we want. And this is something we need to accept, that we fail on that. Telling that, I'm going to speak more about the issue of health, because the pandemic was directly affecting the health of the people, but it's affecting the health of the women and the girls. And this is something that is still there. How it was? Well, you realize the relation among SDG 3 and SDG 5, and we are losing our capacity to have access to contraception, the basic things. So during the pandemic, we was a decrease and a backlash that it depends on the regions and it depends where we are. But in Latin America, we consider the backlash was 20 years, more or less, in Latin America and the Caribbean. And that's what it means, that we need now to recover these 20 years and go further. But in a moment in which our countries are not having so much money to invest in contraceptives and all the things we need. And what about the UN agency? UNFPA is not able also to do that. So what are we doing? So this is something in which we need to train the developed countries to invest in the 07, what we call always 07% for external cooperation. But they are not doing that also. And this is something that is urgently. And of course, if we talk about the issue of abortion, this is not only money for the services, it's policy, the policies. We are going back. Well, I don't need to say this country, no? But, everywhere. So there were few countries in which we could advance. And this is not only money. So this is also the issue of politics. And this was not good. So what we are having now in this high-level political forum is that in the papers, they are not including gender equality. And they are not including gender equality because there are those things that I'm talking, and also the recognition of the right of the non-binary people to be included. So I work hard for the Cairo Convention. What about now? We need to start again. This is terrible. We are turning, and now we need to start again, but in a position in which the world is using the economical crisis as an excuse. Sorry to say, but we need to denounce here that this is an excuse. This is not real the problem. The problem is the politics besides. It's not the money. It's not the money. The money has something to do, of course, but not only. But also we need to recognize that in the terms of the capacity of the women, poverty increased more in women and girls than in the rest of the population. So the issue of the economic care that it was saying before is so important, because there is the key also how we are going to recover the possibility to be able to incorporate in the labor force if we are not having support for the care. And this is something that we are fighting. We call in different ways many years ago, 30 years or something like that, but it's the same and nothing happens. And about what was said, We, last year in Latin America, and the Caribbean, we have the conference on women's that it used to be each 3 years, and it was dedicated for the care economy and how to build that. And what we are pushing there is that, first of all, we need infrastructure. We have no sufficient infrastructure to give those services. But we also need to create the shops. And those shops are going to be more for women, because those women that is supporting and helping for those cares are those that lost their shops at the beginning. So poverty appeared in the women that they were not poor before because they could work, but they have no social protection. They have nothing. They were individuals working by themselves, no trade unions for them, no trade unions they are having alone with this. So this is something that we need to change. And here it doesn't appear nothing on that. When I said here, I said in the high level political forum, we didn't listen to nothing about that, or something, but nothing concrete. So when we talk about actions, we need to request those actions. We need to ensure the access to the health services and the sexual and reproductive health, because they are the most important issue that affects the life, not only the health, the life of the women. And second, we need to have those economic care support, because this is something also that allowed us, of course the men also, but principally the women, to be able to enter the labor force. And ILO helps a lot on that, but it's not sufficient, but because here no one is talking about those actions we need. So what I want to say is that we have had some backup before, because healthcare services were privatized in also developing countries, in Latin America, in Africa, in the Caribbean, following the model of the developed countries. And the model was a disaster, sorry to say, but it's the truth. And so this is coming back. So now we need to recover the public services, because the public services are the services for everybody. But it's very difficult. And what are we suffering now is that in developing countries, it's very difficult. The person, medical doctors, psychologists, all of them, they want to leave to developed countries, because in our countries, in developing, they are not able to obtain the salaries they want to have and they used to have before. So this is the problem in which we are. So this is something also to address, that what we have been doing before in the organization of the health systems are not coming back against us. So this is another issue that we need to consider. So I'm not giving you a lot of good news, but I think I'm giving you concrete issues we need to fight here. And let know our countries here what we need. And let's see if in the biennales are they approaching this. I'm afraid now. So maybe in the questions, maybe it's possible to include some of these. Thank you.
Thank you, Mabel. When you were talking particularly about Cairo, I was thinking, what was different from Cairo to now? And then I thought, well, we developed a lot of evidence from Cairo to now to inform our requests, right? It's not only because they are right, but there is a completely rational behind what we are saying. But even though governments are not implementing it, and then again, using, as you're saying, the economic crisis or whatever crisis is in place at the moment to refuse our rights. So I think that perhaps we need to reinforce our national capacities at the ground. Because we need to influence our governments before coming to the UN, because they're coming to here and making, decisions, sometimes advancing with some language that they are not implementing at home. But at the same time, in countries like our countries in Latin America, where health and education in many countries are recognized as public rights within the constitutions, they are privatizing those services. And we have seen a backlash. And we have seen that even if they have, for instance, systems for tax systems that are progressive, and they raise more funds, more domestic funds to implement the SDGs, there is no guarantee they use that for gender equality, because there is no such commitment real for gender equality. And I have kind of deja vu, because I think last year I was in a room like that saying the same thing. And with that, I'd like to give the floor to Barbara. Please enlighten us.
Please give us some.
Because this judgmental thing is very hard for us. Barbara, you have the floor.
Yes, I think, I don't know, I'm so glad Mabel spoke before me, because I don't know if I've got good news either. No, but I would also like to say that I'm going to mention some things that I hear going on here in New York amongst member states from senior leadership and so on. And I'm going to sort of ask you whether you think it's real. I'm going to ask you whether you think it's a space and an area which gives us the opportunity for more work. Whatever we're talking about, it's always more work. Be ready for that bit. I mean, we know that, right? But just having some kind of an assessment of where we are right now and what kinds of opportunities. We've heard a lot already about how we know what's wrong, how work we've been doing, how we've been developing advocacy, how we've developed instruments in all kinds of ways, how we work in a whole variety of ways. And Mabel expressed very clearly frustrations, which I think a lot of us share. The first thing I think I'd like to make a comment about is we reiterate and we know how important the public sector is. We know how important it is for women's rights. We know how important it is for health. We know how important it is. I mean, education, food, housing, these are rights. They are not going to be provided by market solutions. Okay, so when we talk about partnerships, we've got to think very clearly about how we work in partnerships and to whom partnerships are accountable. And quite often they're only accountable to those who choose to join the partnership. And I haven't seen many partnerships, frankly, that are committed to increasing rights. Okay, so I think we really have to think very carefully about where partnerships themselves as a concept fit. And part of the reason I say that is because the 2030 agenda didn't go on and on about partnerships, but SDGs themselves, one of the key ways in which we seem to be imploring the way forward is through partnerships, where it's all hands on deck, everybody, etc. We don't have any decent rules for those partnerships. We have some guidelines. We don't have any monitoring. We don't have conflict of interest criteria. And so there are lots of examples there which I could give you. So if that is something that we think really matters, we've really got to go further into a lot of these areas on conflict of interest. But what I also would say is we've talked a lot about the importance of the public finance, public revenue taxes, absolutely. And there have been some recent developments in the UN in the second committee, which Bonnie was referencing. And one of the things we should really emphasize there was that at the end of the day was something that was leadership by the Africa group when the negotiations that were taking place, I mean, frankly, the OECD countries wanted to keep doing the tax business in the OECD without going into the details. And there's been a long-standing determination that that should be in the auspices with the UN, which is global, universal, etc., etc. And it was hard work. And the work that was also taking place with a lot of civil society organizations, with the Africa group that said, no, we're not going to compromise, we're putting this resolution on the table. And that is what has kick-started some of what Bonnie was talking about. Please do not underestimate how important and how difficult some of that work is taking place. Now, the other side of that, that's revenue. That's taxation that brings in public revenue. We have got to continuously be vigilant about how that money is spent. Okay, we've already had very helpful comments about why are we calling this expenditure? This is investment. Okay, absolutely. You know, it ends up in the cost side of the budget. And so providing decent education, etc., is a cost to society. So I think we really need to, these words matter, and we can work on this everywhere. But the other side of it, Paris, we're talking about the Paris Agreement, we're talking about the climate crisis, we're talking about rescuing the SDGs, we're talking about all hands on deck. More and more public money, national and 0.7 ODA, afraid it's not going to get us there, is being used to incentivize bringing in private money. This isn't new, but the emphasis is even stronger, particularly around the climate conversations. Because basically the idea is that we need to change the way in which business, corporate, how business is done. Therefore, we've got to provide incentives to change that. And the only way to provide those incentives, frankly, is to underwrite them, guarantee them, incentivize them with public revenue. On the one hand, we've got a hard time increasing public revenue because of the complete imbalances in tax, regressive tax, tax evasion, illicit financial flows, etc. So we're beginning to make some progress in addressing those issues. But at the same time, we're also finding that the conversation about how that money should be spent, that public money, is also being channeled. Now, in some areas, yes, okay, let's not just kind of make it easy, no, that's all bad, throw it all out. But we really need to be careful here. We really need to be careful. I want to read you a couple of quotes. I don't usually get to quote the Secretary General. But he's been on form lately. So first of all, I'd like to actually allow my laptop to wake up. There we go. I think you all know Davos, you know, the World Economic Forum, and you know that the Secretary General senior leadership has been going there for a while, in a whole, for whatever. Let's talk about the future, not the past. So at the last meeting in Davos, March, I think it was, I'm not quite sure, it might have been February. This is what the Secretary General said to the captains of industry, etc., who were there. Talked about the gross inequity in vaccine distribution. And he talked about the pandemic recovery with support overwhelmingly concentrated in wealthier countries that could print money. We're sitting in the country at the moment that certainly can print money and have it accepted and desired and used by all countries in the world to buy essential services. And we also know that we're sitting in a situation where any crisis, whether it's a crisis as in Ukraine, whatever crisis, means there's more demand for the reserve currency, the dollar. So the value of the dollar goes up, every other currency vis-a-vis it goes down. That still has to buy food, fertilizer, whatever, as a result of something they had absolutely no say in. Okay, so we've got a systemic problem. And I have to say, I hadn't heard the SG calling this out before. That's why I'm quoting him today. And he goes on to say trillions were printed in the global north, and of course developing countries could not print money because their currencies would go down the drain. I don't know who his speechwriter was this day, but never mind. So he went on to also say that this is a morally bankrupt financial system. I thought of that when you were referring to the global financial architecture, in which systemic inequalities are amplifying societal inequalities. A system that is still routinely denying debt relief and concessional funding to vulnerable middle-income countries that are in desperate need, because these rules are not made to allow it. It's calling out the rules. Okay, this is different. This is different. At least it's different to me, and I've been hanging around these basements for far too long. A system in which most of the world's poorest countries, so their debt service payments skyrocketed by 35% in the last year alone. And we have more and more data with the cost of living crisis, etc., with the increase in the interest rates. I don't know if you've been hearing it here at the HLPF, that the interest rates then for developing countries are like 4 times needed. You might be having to pay up to 20% to borrow money that you need to meet. And again, cross-border drivers of inequality, issues that are not caused in the country concerned. He also went on to sort of, I mean, obviously he's talking to the private sector, he's in Davos, and he recognizes the role as indispensable. But then he also was talking about the need for different regulatory framework and so on. And he then also addressed the whole issue around net zero and some of the targets that we are needing to reach, for example, in the Paris context. And he went on to say, the truth is that more and more businesses are making net zero commitments, but benchmarks and criteria are often dubious or murky, and these can mislead consumers, investors, and regulators with false narratives, and it feeds a culture of climate misinformation and confusion and leaves the door open to greenwashing. You can imagine, I enjoy these quotes. So my question is this, and again, more of the same. There is this, the Secretary General has put a number of things on the table. There's a lot of debate about the merits of them, okay? And I'm not really intending to go into that kind of conversation unless people want to. But as part of the preparation, there's a report from this high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism. And one of the things that their report and the preparations have said loud and clear is, yes, there is a crisis in multilateralism. A crisis in a whole variety of ways, polycrisis. There's also a crisis in decision-making. And so we had a quote from the co-chair of this saying that there is a need for greater equity and fairness in global decision-making. It's about fair representation, but also equally distributed power and resources. Now, if you think about it, It's not surprising, I hate to say that word, it's not surprising that we end up with outcomes of failures to implement, finance, measure things that we think are really important if the decision-making process reflects the same kinds of inequalities that are existing in the work that we are doing in societies. And this is the thing I wanted to mention to you and more or less to ask you. To me, this is new. I have not been hearing some of this conversation before. And so I think we've got, and there are a couple of particular work streams. I can't imagine I got this far without mentioning gender, but I'll keep going. There are a couple of work streams that are underway related to this process. One of them is, and it was in the 2030 agenda, it's in goal 17. One of them is the importance of coming up with new measures of progress. We are completely dominated, like it or not, in economic, macroeconomic terms, measuring your credibility, whether you can borrow from capital markets, etc., by GDP, gross domestic product, and GDP per capita. There are a lot of things that GDP doesn't measure. It doesn't measure wealth. It doesn't measure wealth inequalities. We know it doesn't do justice in the care economy context. It doesn't measure not having pollution, etc. One of the things that is on the agenda is a beyond GDP aspect, and is actually getting some traction. There seems to be agreement. It's in, I don't know how many of you have been following the negotiations on the political declaration for the SDG summit. And one of the things, of course, that is very strong in is the way it doesn't take into account elements of unpaid care work and social reproduction. It also, as I say, doesn't take into account, in fact, it's rather the opposite. It incentivizes consumption. It incentivizes pollution. Okay, when we think of it. So I think there might be a space here for what we care about. And if we change the way in which we actually measure what is good, what we want to achieve, so many of the agreements that we work for get completely changed because they don't get financed or they get measured in whatever ways. The other work stream I want to mention is the one on the need to reform the international financial architecture. And we've got more and more statements pointing out that the international financial architecture, the Bretton Woods institutions, the institutions that basically the IMF, the World Bank, determine whether the country needs to go to the IMF to get a loan because of debt, etc. I won't go into all the details. These were set up in 1944-45, before most of the countries in the world were politically independent. It's a governance problem. And there is also great concern about the way in which the public resources side of it, through the World Bank and the multilateral development banks, have actually not helped with fossil fuel subsidies to foreign reform, etc., etc. And there is work underway to reform all of this. There was a big meeting in Paris recently called by the French president, which a lot of civil society groups complained about. Fair enough. 40 heads of state and government from developing countries turned up and really pushed their case and voice for how this financial architecture actually works against them and doesn't support them. And they are coming into debt distress. We know that, we've heard it already. How are they going to be able to finance what we're talking about? How are they going to be able to finance the commitments in the Paris Agreement? if you look at these agreements that they sign, they have to pay, and they pay more to debt servicing than they do to healthcare. Okay. So these issues, what I'm trying to say is, I don't know if it's a depressing moment or a not depressing moment. I don't know what to say, but I do know these issues are on the table. Okay, and so there is maybe there's a different kind of conversation. Maybe,
Yeah.
Maybe. Is that the right time to stop? Maybe. Okay, no, but really, I think I would really appreciate. I feel like people are not hearing about this. And sometimes when you don't hear about things in the New York headquarters bubble, that's the right thing. They're not worth hearing about. So, don't get distracted. But that's partly why I just wanted to say, and also for people to think about and to assess how relevant, what kind of space it provides, and so on. So.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I just remember that the government of Honduras, just on the next door, made exactly this comment, explaining that they were a middle-income countries, although they have 74% of people on poverty. And I think that in this process, perhaps it's also important to recall people that when we are talking about systems, sometimes it seems something so distant, right? Like big thing outside that system. But in the end, it is about people, and few people controlling these decisions and making those wrong decisions that are at the end problem of governance. So perhaps what we need to do is just keep fighting and keep pushing and keep coming and keep speaking and not giving up, never. So with that, still have half hour to our conversation. And I'd like to open the floor for all of you. And just keep in mind that those with the microphones will be recorded. So if you have any problem to be recorded, you can say. If not, go ahead, and then perhaps you can make some video after with this session to share with people, etc., etc. So it's open the floor.
Alessandra Fortini,
Sorry, please go ahead.
Thank you. Such a fascinating, thought-provoking, interesting discussion. I mean, we could stay, personally, I could stay here for hours and listen to all of you, although we've been here since early morning. So a quick question is, I have read the research by UNWOMEN and the ILO on the care investments and the impact. It's another piece of fascinating research, the multiple benefits for the economy. Do you have any examples of a government that has actually used that research to design such investments in their care economy? That would be something very interesting to hear more about. Thank you.
Thank you for taking. Please say your name and organization.
We're among friends.
Oh, no, I know it.
Boa noite a todas. Eu vou falar em português, vou contar com a ajuda da tradução. Eu sou a Letícia Leubert, sou do GESTOS, Instituto da Mulher Negra.
So good evening, everyone. I'm Leticia. I represent GESTOS, an Institute of Black Women in Brazil.
Vou falar em português porque, infelizmente, para nós mulheres negras, a barreira linguística ainda é uma questão no Brasil.
So I speak in Portuguese because, unfortunately, in Brazil, language knowledge is still a barrier.
E o meu questionamento é pensar como nós estamos olhando para a demarcação dos nossos posicionamentos, das questões de interseccionalidade, para não correr o risco de que a gente avance a partir desses caminhos que foram apresentados, e acho importante que a Alessandra mencionou que nós temos caminhos para realizar esses enfrentamentos, sem incluir todas as mulheres.
So how are we looking to the demarcation of our position? Yes, when we think about intersectionality, so we don't have the risk to move forward in ways that were shown here. And we need really to reach a goal. So how can we really reach this goal, speaking about intersectionally?
E mais grave do que isso, né, ao não combater, correr o risco de reforçar a exclusão de mulheres que estão mais vulnerabilizadas.
And worse than that, if we don't fight, we have the risk of not having a voice about the issues presented here.
No caso do Brasil, as mulheres negras, indígenas e quilombolas.
So talking about Brazil, we have Black women, Indigenous women, and Quilombolas women.
E por fim, como enquanto grupo, nós estamos olhando para o enfrentamento do racismo a nível global.
And as a group, how are we looking when we think about racism in the global level?
Entendendo que não é possível alcançar o desenvolvimento sustentável sem o enfrentamento do racismo. Obrigada.
Considering that it's not possible to reach effectively the global goals if we don't mention women and racism.
Thanks so much for this event and for this space. This is not specifically a question, it's more a comment. Because during the Mabel's intervention, she mentioned the importance of the relation between LGD3 and LGD5. And personally, I don't agree more. I so agree with that, especially in the issue of the reproductive rights. And consider this, I would like to raise the issue of the decent menstruation for all women and girls in all the world, especially the girls and the women in rural communities. According to the UNICEF data, 35.6% of girls don't attend school during the menstruation period, losing 1 week of school per month every month. This is horrible data, but it's the reality. Here we're facing of the intersection of the LGD5, LGD3, and LGD4. And if we want to make this problem bigger, the lack of water also limits decent menstruation, especially in rural areas, because girls and women don't have water during the menstruation period, because that communities don't have water. And now we have in the problem LGD6 for the girls and the women. And all of these about result in gender violence, because don't have a decent menstruation is gender violence, especially if you don't attend school for that reason. We need invest to have a dignified menstruation, because the menstruation and the dignity of the women and girls are not a privilege, it's a right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, Percy,
Sorry, I think we can have 5 questions and when return, right? Okay. 6. And we return.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you all. I am Mexican, I'm from Mexico, and I'm a feminist. I'm an eco-feminist. I've been mostly the entire of my youth. But the thing that I want to add, and thank you all for mentioning the importance of climate change and gender, since it's a very important factor to mention. And mostly ignored in this type of events, the high political forum. Why? Because I've been studying, I work with my local government in the part of the environmental secretary. So I've been conducting an investigation regarding the impacts in women and girls regarding the internally displacement. So what is something we can do as feminists, as eco-feminists to well, engage in the decision makings and the decision making system, and it's very patriarchal. So what can we do to yeah, to like tell our governments to pay attention to that problem, because climate change affects very differently girls and women than men, and that's something they're not taking yes, accountability. So yeah, that was my question, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. My name is Catherine. I'm also from Mexico. So mine is more like a comment, because early morning today, I was at the UNWOMEN in Mexico, at the government of Mexico side event on community care. And they were talking there about labor, domestic work, how it needs to be paid, because domestic work sustains the capital. That's it. And we, as well, the ambassadors of Mexico, Chile, and Argentina realized that in Latin America, we have been talking about this for a long time ago, and we demand for public policy for women who have in the labor informal market, and because not because they want to, but it is a need, and they are pushed to be in informal jobs because of the time. Sometimes it's 8 hours, sometimes it's 16 hours per week. Per day to work with. So the ambassador of Chile, and this is, if I may, this is answering a question over there. She said, I'm tired of creating public policies that only represent giving women the responsibility. And it's time to create co-responsibility public policies for share the care and this type of work. So I think from some countries, we are still pushing. It's not done yet, but we are pushing for that. And how the caregivers are not taken into consideration as important persons in our communities, and we should do that. And of course, migrant women and refugees, it's even harder for them because they don't have the support and a group that take care of them when they are in another country. It's even harder for them. So if we don't have each other, what else do we have, right? So yeah, and I applaud your work. It's really, really, it's been like a hug to the heart. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so the last one, and then really last ones are the, oh my gosh.
Two times.
Okay, the two, and that's it.
É mais um complicado também, porque eu já fui contemplada, mas eu sou Virgilene Dias, sou do Brasil, sou de comunidade quilombola.
So it's more a comment because I have already been felt part of the other comment of my colleagues. So I am Virgilene Dias, I'm from Brazil, and I am quilombola.
E dentro de no Brasil, eu sou assessora jurídica de uma organização de comunidades quilombolas, Coordenação Nacional de Articulação das Comunidades Quilombolas.
So in Brazil, I'm the coordinator, the lawyer coordinator of the articulation of quilombolas communities.
E dentro dessa organização a gente tem um coletivo de mulheres, e eu fiquei muito feliz de ouvir questões, todas as exposições colocadas aqui hoje, gostaria muito de compartilhar com elas no Brasil.
So inside this group, we have a specific group for women, and I'm very glad to hear everything that I have said here today, because I would like to share this with this group of women there.
Principalmente com relação à questão socioeconômica, né? Porque as mulheres quilombolas não têm umas especificidades, e aí por isso eu fui muito contemplada na pergunta da companheira Letícia aqui do Gueledés,
So specifically speaking about socioeconomic issues, because I really felt contemplated with the saying of my colleague Leticia from Galedes.
Porque a gente costuma dizer que acho que não tem como pensar na política, pensar na questão de gênero sem não pensar nas intersecções, né? E as mulheres no Brasil, apesar de ter políticas voltadas para as mulheres quilombolas têm suas questões mais específicas, elas são as mulheres rurais e fazem muito trabalho braçal, muitas vezes não tem de onde tirar renda.
So we cannot think about socioeconomic issues if we don't think about intersectional issues as well. So we can see that women, like in my community, they live in rural areas and sometimes they don't have access to basic things and basic policies.
E por isso a importância, a gente costuma dizer no Brasil, porque tem uma política lá chamada de Bolsa Família, que o Bolsa Família, que foi criado ainda no governo Lula, foi uma carta de alforria, porque tiraram muitas mulheres quilombolas de situações de violência, inclusive violências pelos próprios parceiros.
So I'd like to mention a program in Brazil named Bolsa Familia, and it was very important. It was created during Lula president period, and it really helped women because it took the burden of the informal labor, yes, in a great measure.
Por isso a importância de pensar a questão de gênero a nível internacional, não só de gênero, mas pensar nas intersecções de mulheres a partir dos seus locais e das suas necessidades específicas, ou da sua cultura também.
So it's really important to think about on a global level about these issues and specifically about women needs inside those communities because they have a lot of specificities that you need to consider and take into account.
Thank you very much. I will ask you to be very short now, because we need to have the opportunity to listen to our guests.
All right, thank you. My name is Chipasha Mwanta from Zambia. I'm a feminist, and I work for an organization called Akina Mama Wa Africa. Mine is not a question, it's rather a comment on what has been discussed, and what piqued my interest and got me reflecting is on partnerships and leveraging these partnerships and how we can work better effectively by giving some case examples of Zambia and how we have been trying to work in harnessing partnerships and our comparative advantages. So I'll give an example of the creation of coalitions, but this time around with the government, ensuring that we are working closely with the different ministries that are of interest. I'll give an example of the Ministry of Health that has set up different working groups, such as the Safe Abortion Advisory Group, in a very conservative country, but we have also what is termed as a progressive law on abortion. Safe abortion that goes back as far as 1972. But communication information about this law has been very minimal. The only thing that is not about safe abortion or abortion, in fact, what is communicated is on abortion and not the safety of it, is that it is illegal. And so having a group such as the SAG that is commissioned and convened by the Ministry of Health gives it legitimacy, but also offers accountability. Another such working group is the RAMCAN, the Reproductive, Maternal, Neonatal, and Adolescent Health and Nutrition, that has different civil society organizations come together and develop an investment case. As earlier mentioned, health or any other social intervention is an investment, and we can no longer look at it as an expenditure, which we have made the mistake of doing for so many years. But within just the RAMCAN coalition and having different stakeholders, we also have the government. And so what we're calling for now under the RAMCAN coalition is for investing in all the sectors that are in the RAMCAN, the reproductive, maternal, neonatal, adolescent health, and ensuring that this investment finds its way in the national health budget, because it's not enough to say we're going to provide RAMCAN, but not have finances for it, which is key. So working closely with government and starting these engagements at home has really seen us make some headway, and we're really excited to see what next, especially around reproductive health. So just some cases and examples from back home. Thank you.
So I really a positive experience. The last one, please.
Oui, je vais être courte. Je m'appelle.
Please speak close to the microphone.
C'est bon, c'est.
Can someone?
Je m'appelle Atissa, je viens du Maroc. Et donc là, je me sens plus ou moins exclue des discussions générales. Enfin, j'ai peur d'intervenir et d'être dans la contradiction. D'autant plus, je vois que l'anglais est la langue hégémonique au niveau des Nations Unies. Donc, je voudrais pas.
I'm Atika, I'm from Morocco. I must say that I feel a little bit excluded because of the language, since English is the main language.
Donc là, je suis là, c'est donc pour apporter justement, pour apporter quelque chose, pour participer pleinement aux discussions. Et puis, c'est pour le retour aussi, c'est qu'il y a ce que je dois transmettre à mes collègues de travail et en même temps transmettre aux femmes avec qui je travaille. Nous faisons un travail de proximité, de terrain, et nous travaillons avec des femmes et nous connaissons leurs besoins. Et par rapport à tout ce qui s'est dit, bon, bien sûr, au niveau de l'Assemblée générale, et il y a la traduction, on comprend, mais bien sûr,
So I work a lot with local communities and I would like to bring back everything we've heard here. And so it would be great to have also more information now in our languages.
Donc, peut-être que je propose au niveau du Women Major Group, que je remercie pleinement, je propose des rapports, c'est-à-dire au niveau des side events, je propose des rapports instantanés et qu'on puisse, peut-être qu'il y a des latino-américains, nous sommes d'Afrique francophone, même si je suis aussi arabophone, mais donc on n'est pas les dominantes, mais ce que je propose, qu'il y ait des rapports instantanés et parallèlement, on pourrait faire la traduction.
Yeah, so she was looking at the great simultaneous translation happening on the site and she would have loved to have something similar in French or in Arabic. Thank you.
Bon, en espagnol, à nous de le faire, oui, voilà. Bon.
So thank you very much for your comments and questions, and we really apologize for not having translation for Portuguese and French. We tried, and Spanish. We tried, but it was not possible to have this time, but we will keep trying, as everything that we do, we will keep trying. So before I hand over to our panelists, I'd like to have your comments and responses in 3 minutes each, if possible. But there was another question that someone gave to me, which is, what is the role of partnerships with feminists for public investments in order to achieve the 2030 agenda? So this is the last question. And please, you have the floor.
Sure, and thank you so much. And I feel like I've learned so much listening to the other panelists, but also from people who have commented and provided questions and reflections from the floor. So thank you again. I have a few reflections and I will try to be quick and not too jumbled. On that last question, something that Save the Children is doing, we work in over 116 countries, including Zambia, and many of the other countries that are represented here today. And something that we try to do is work in communities and involve them in public budgeting, getting their views and assessments, and to take a look at budgets and analyze how they are or are not gender or child responsive. And we're also working on looking at investment cases, the cost of not investing, as opposed to looking at it as an expenditure and not a public benefit. And I wanted to reflect on the comments that you made, because I thought it was really beautiful, the way you articulated the interlinked nature, the integrated interlinked nature of the SDGs and the beauty of the 2030 agenda that really has a balance between the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of social development, of sustainable development. I'm speaking too fast to try to keep in the 3-minute time limit, so you may slow down. And that actually brought me to a reflection on something that you said, Alessandra, about a lack of commitments and in gender responsive budgeting, and it's actually, we do have the commitments, and through the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, governments did commit themselves to gender responsive budgeting, but they're not delivering on that. And one of the issues that we have here with the United Nations and the many hours that we spent to influence the negotiations and the outcome documents, such as the Addis Ababa Action Agenda or the 2030 Agenda, or various other General Assembly resolutions, is that they're non-binding. So there's a real lack of enforceability and accountability mechanisms to ensure that these commitments that are made are implemented, and that is precisely why, when we're talking about the taxation issues, that we're pushing for a binding UN convention. And reflecting on what you said, Barbara, it's not a surprise that the same countries that in the halls are, when we're talking about the means of implementation for the 2030 Agenda, are really pushing hard on private sector solutions, are those same countries that are also looking to the OECD for resolving all the issues that we have with taxation. Because where are those multinational corporations and the private sector companies based? They're based in exactly those countries. So we need a binding UN tax convention that is agreed here at the United Nations, where every country has one voice, one vote. And I'll end on the point around maybe, and whether or not there is some hope for the future. Well, member states did tentatively agree to hold a 4th international conference on financing for development in 2025. So that could be a place where we address some of these massive structural and systemic issues. But we need a country to come forward and say that they're willing to host that. So maybe when we go home, we can think about who we need to step forward and push hard. Thank you.
Jemimah, thank you very much.
Thank you. I have to say I'm learning a lot as well. I can't speak as fast as that. I wanted to actually first reflect on something that you said, Barbara, because I'm also increasingly inspired by the Secretary General of late. And so yesterday he actually said that 3.3 billion people are living in countries that are paying more in debt than they are spending in education and health. So I think on a general level, these issues are becoming much more clearer, including in this bubble, in terms of where the problem lies and what needs to be done. I think now getting from there to what you're saying, to then getting to these binding commitments, I think is the next big step, and how we as the feminist movement need to then influence how that looks like. Coming to that last question that you asked, Alessandra, on what would then be the role of feminist movements in these conversations. There's a whole growing conversation around, the global financial architecture not working, the current economic models not working, but then we get stuck there. So there's discussion around what then should that look like? What are the parameters of what that should look like? If we can even start thinking about that as a movement and putting that out there, that this is what they should look like. If we're talking about beyond GDP, member states are negotiating, but do we have an idea for us as a movement what that needs to look like? So that's just out there in terms of, you know, that last question you've thrown out. I want to respond to you. This work we've been doing is about 3.5 years old, and it is only now that we are starting to see the fruits of that work. And there's several ways we are seeing that. A lot of countries, I cannot even tell whether 3, 4, 5 years ago, we had a country that just had a national policy on care. Just on care, thinking about both paid and unpaid care work. And we are seeing an increasing number of countries really look at that data and say, we need a national policy on care. And we know that having that policy framework is the first step in terms of making the investments that are needed. The Latin America countries came together and signed the Buenos Aires Agreement last November. A lot of them have gone forward and developed their integrated care systems policies. The last one to do it was Ecuador a couple of months ago. And so we are starting to see that progress. We are starting to see specific investments at subnational level. Colombia making investments on care infrastructure in cities. Yeah, Ecuador borrowing that model and doing that. Last week, Mexico launched a map of where all the care facilities in the country are, so that they can see where are the gaps. Argentina, you were there this morning talking about the same thing, that they want to follow suit and actually start with looking at where are their public care services and where are the gaps. And anyway, countries like Egypt, it's not just Latin America, taking all that data and it's now part of a sustainable financing framework. So the moment that is adopted, then we know issues of care are integrated in that framework. So starting to see progress, but I think part of it is now how we maintain the accountability for the delivery of those commitments that are being made. Brazil, I think you make a very important point. As we have these global conversations beyond GDP, taxation, how do we reflect the lived realities of women on the ground? How do we make sure that those voices are heard? Because people always say, we want women's voices in the room. Women's voices, women are always speaking. We are always speaking. I think the problem isn't that we are not speaking. The problem is, are we being heard? Is what we are saying getting into the right places, the right tables, and action being taken to? So we really need to be doing from the ground act, and that's really important. In terms of accountability for partnerships, we have, and this, I'm not saying it's perfect, but 2021, the Generation Equality Forum and the partnerships that have emerged out of that Generation Equality Forum that brings together governments, private sector, civil society, youth leaders, everybody, to commit to gender equality. And we actually have an accountability mechanism, an annual accountability mechanism, where everyone's reporting on the commitments that they have made. We have just closed the commitment process for this year, and then develop a public report for people to actually see the commitments that were made in 2021, where were we in 2022, where were we in 2023. So I think we need to make this more the norm, because commitments are being made in the room and people are walking out of rooms and nothing is ever heard of this. So making sure that these are actually built in. The last thing I wanted to say, because it was, this is very exciting for us, because as we've been working with member states, we've been working with communities, with grassroots community, care workers, everybody, one of the things we really are going to get this year before the end of the month is the resolution going to the General Assembly to have an observance of the International Day of Care and Support. And we think this is really a big step because we start to galvanize and advocate for comprehensive care systems. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mabel.
I'm going to be very short because they were saying so many things. First of all, I think we need to be clear that we need to recover our monitoring process. But now the issue is that we need to put together all those initiatives because they were many. And the problem is they are not all related. And this is the problem because Chef Gender Equality Forum was a great idea, but it's not in this, it's outside. And this is the problem. We are doing things outside. We need to do things here, because here is where the power is. And this is one of the problems I think we need to have this opportunity. And I think we need to be clear and to have a movement in which we are not only those more technically, with technical capacity. We need to go to reach the grassroots capacity. And this is the challenge we have, because there is the real power. So we need to do that. And I'm very happy that we have so many here, and specifically from Latin America, but I think we need to bring more people from other regions, from the grassroots, to be discussing here with more technical words, because if not, this is not going to be any result. So I think we need to start doing things, but we need to be doing very soon, because we have no more time to lose. And this is something that we need to recognize. And I think we don't need to depress, we need to recover our fight capacity. I invite all of you to be fighting at your level and be connected, all of us, in order we are going to have a strong movement, as we did many years ago. We need to recover this.
I think listening to all of the questions and comments for me, I just feel we need to really be strategic about where we work to make gains. And we have examples of this being in different places. And I think that, sometimes I think we just have to turn the whole UN thing on its head. What the UN is supposed to be doing is supporting the work you're talking about. And I shouldn't really bring up a new topic, but I get a little bit worried with what Ronnie said about binding, not because it isn't absolutely and 100% what we need for the global level to be helpful, so that there are rights that can be used for mobilizing. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact, frankly, that at the moment it's the investors and the corporations that are getting more rights. And so we've got to use the moment, and we've got to organize correctly for when we go to whatever that binding is, so to speak. And then having sort of now just disagreeing with myself, just to let you know that there is a process underway to take the right to development, which is a declaration at the moment, to the convention level as a binding instrument. And there is a lot of what we're talking about that's already involved in that process that could frankly be seriously up to notch. And so that is where these kinds of spaces and mobilizing, thinking of your question, would be really helpful. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
What a wonderful session. Thank you very much for coming. I think that we are leaving with some key messages, which remind us that perhaps we need to challenge a little bit this monitoring framework for the SDGs. We need to have stronger framework to monitor the SDGs. Also, I think it's important to remind from this conversation that the economic and finance area, they were created for not being influenced by us mortals, right? So this point of translating and making sure that the grassroots will understand that will depend also on education on finance for these people. We need to educate our young people. Also, that private sector is not, the bad guys on the room, room, but they need to be regulated. They need to be accountable for the process. And definitely they have not been the solution as they want to believe. So public services, they matter for everyone. They are super important. And this is our message here. And also I think the very important point is to change from expenditures for investments. When we are investing in our rights, we are not expending money. We are investing in our future, in our rights, and they must fit in our constitutions and national budgets. Okay, so let's continue, let's move forward. Thank you, everyone.